Nadia sat frozen in seat 2A, her hands trembling as flight attendant Claudette's voice cut through the first-class cabin like a blade. "Security is coming to remove you from this aircraft." 20 passengers stared at her like she was a criminal. She was 16 years old, just trying to fly home. Nobody believed she belonged here. Then the aircraft door opened, and a woman stepped aboard that Claudette never saw coming. Before we dive into what happens next, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you believe every young person deserves to be treated with dignity, and subscribe because this story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare began. San Francisco International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to gates, dragging suitcases, checking phones, living their separate lives in a shared space. Nadia Hayes stood at gate 37, clutching her boarding pass with both hands, trying to steady her breathing. She was 16, dressed in a black hoodie and jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Inside that backpack was her laptop, her science notebook filled with equations and diagrams, and a certificate from Stanford University certifying her participation in the National Science Summit for High Achievers. She had spent 3 intense days presenting her research on renewable energy solutions to some of the brightest minds in the country. Professors had congratulated her. Graduate students had asked for her contact information. She had felt for those 3 days like she was exactly where she belonged. Now standing at this gate, that confidence was already beginning to crack. Her mother, Loretta Hayes, Attorney General of California, had apologized a dozen times for not being able to attend the conference with her. A critical case required her presence in Sacramento, but she had promised to meet Nadia in New York, where they would spend a long weekend together before Nadia returned to school. To make up for her absence, Loretta had done something she rarely did. She had purchased a first-class ticket for her daughter. "You worked so hard, baby," she had said over the phone the night before. "You deserve to be comfortable. Enjoy it." Nadia had never flown first class before. She was excited and nervous in equal measure. The gate agent, a middle-aged man named Gilbert with thinning hair and a permanent frown, took Nadia's boarding pass when she approached. He glanced at it, then at her, then back at the pass. His frown deepened. "This is first class, sweetheart," he said slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not understand English. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Nadia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "My mom bought it for me." Gilbert studied the ticket again, holding it up to the light like he was checking for counterfeit bills. Behind Nadia, the line was growing. A woman in a business suit sighed loudly. Gilbert didn't seem to care. He picked up his phone and called someone. "Hey, yeah, I've got a situation here. Young girl with a first-class boarding pass. Can you come verify Nadia's stomach twisted?" She wanted to say something, to demand to know why she was being treated differently than the passengers before her, all of whom had breezed through without a second glance. But she stayed quiet the way her mother had taught her. "Don't make a scene. Be polite. Prove them wrong with your dignity." A supervisor arrived, a stern-looking woman who examined Nadia's boarding pass, her passport, and her driver's license with the intensity of a detective investigating a crime. "Where did you get this ticket?" she asked. "My mother purchased it online," Nadia replied, keeping her voice steady. "What's your mother's name?" "Loretta Hayes." The supervisor typed something into her computer, waited, frowned, typed again. Finally, she handed everything back to Nadia. "Okay, you can board. No apology, no explanation, just permission to do what she had every right to do in the first place." As Nadia walked down the jetway, she noticed that the white passengers behind her had not been subjected to any additional scrutiny. Their tickets had been scanned once and they had moved on. She tried to shake off the feeling of being interrogated, telling herself it was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The moment Nadia stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt the atmosphere shift. The flight attendant standing at the entrance, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed painted on, greeted the passenger ahead of Nadia with warm enthusiasm. "Welcome aboard. Let me help you with that bag." But when Nadia approached, the smile vanished. Claudette, as her name tag read, looked Nadia up and down with an expression that hovered somewhere between confusion and suspicion. "Can I help you find your seat?" she asked, her tone implying that Nadia was lost. "I'm in 2A," Nadia said, holding up her boarding pass. Claudette's eyes narrowed. "Let me see your boarding pass," she said, not as a polite request, but as a demand. Nadia handed it over. Claudette examined it far longer than necessary, then looked at Nadia again. "Okay," she said, finally stepping aside without another word. No welcome, no offer to help with her bag, just cold permission to enter. Seat 2A was a window seat in the second row, luxurious compared to the economy seats Nadia was used to. The leather was soft, the legroom generous. Under different circumstances, she might have felt excited. Instead, she felt like an intruder. As she lifted her backpack toward the overhead bin, she became aware of the woman in the seat beside her, an older white woman in an expensive-looking navy dress with pearls around her neck and a Hermes handbag resting on her lap. The woman whose name Nadia would later learn was Marlene Henderson watched Nadia with thinly veiled distaste. When Nadia finally sat down, Marlene pulled her handbag closer to her body, as if Nadia might reach over and snatch it at any moment. Nadia pretended not to notice. She pulled out a book and tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept replaying the interactions at the gate. Claudette's cold stare, Marlene's protective clutch of her purse. She sent a quick text to her mother. "On the plane. Miss you already." Then she put her phone on airplane mode and waited for takeoff. As the other passengers settled in, Claudette moved through the cabin with a cart offering champagne to the first-class passengers. Nadia watched as she poured glass after glass, smiling and chatting with each person. When Claudette reached row 2, she handed a glass to Marlene, then moved past Nadia without a word. Nadia waited, thinking perhaps Claudette would circle back. She didn't. After a few minutes, Nadia pressed the call button. Claudette appeared, her smile gone. "Yes, could I have some orange juice, please?" Nadia asked politely. Claudette's expression didn't change. "We'll get to economy passengers later," she said. Nadia blinked, confused. "I'm in first class. Seat 2A. Claudette glanced at the seat number as if seeing it for the first time, then checked her passenger manifest. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine," she said, and disappeared. When she returned, she handed Nadia a plastic cup of orange juice, while everyone else in the cabin drank from crystal glassware. Nadia stared at the plastic cup, feeling a lump form in her throat. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. And it was only the beginning. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Around Nadia, passengers reclined in their seats, some opening laptops, others browsing the in-flight entertainment. The hum of the engines was steady and soothing, but Nadia couldn't relax. Her stomach was in knots, not from turbulence, but from the relentless weight of being watched, judged, and found lacking by people who knew nothing about her. She tried to lose herself in her book, but the words blurred together. She was too aware of Marlene beside her, of Claudette moving through the cabin, with that bright fake smile reserved for everyone except her. When the meal service began, Nadia's hopes rose slightly. Surely she thought food would be the same for everyone. Claudette rolled the cart down the aisle, stopping at each row to present the options. "We have filet mignon, pan-seared salmon, or herb-roasted chicken. Which would you prefer?" she asked the man across the aisle. He chose the steak. The woman in front of Nadia chose the salmon. Marlene, after a long deliberation, selected the chicken. When Claudette reached Nadia, her tone changed. "We only have the chicken left," she said flatly, not bothering to wait for a response before placing the tray on Nadia's table. Nadia looked down at the meal. The chicken was drowning in a pool of sauce that looked nothing like the beautifully plated dishes being served to the other passengers. As Claudette turned to leave, the edge of the tray caught on something and tipped slightly. Sauce splattered across Nadia's jeans. "Watch out next time," Claudette said, without looking back as if Nadia had been the one at fault. Nadia grabbed a napkin and tried to blot the stain, her face burning with embarrassment. Marlene made a small noise of disgust and shifted in her seat, leaning as far away from Nadia as the armrest would allow. Nadia excused herself and stood needing to escape, if only for a moment, to the restroom. She walked toward the front of the cabin where the first-class lavatory was located, but before she could reach it, Claudette stepped into her path. "Excuse me," Claudette said sharply. "Where are you going?" Nadia stopped, confused. "The restroom." Claudette crossed her arms. "The first-class lavatory is for first-class passengers only." Nadia felt her patience already stretched thin, beginning to snap. "I am in first class," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Seat 2A." Claudette's eyes narrowed. "Let me verify that," she said, pulling out her passenger manifest once again. Nadia stood in the middle of the aisle, visible to everyone, while Claudette took her time scrolling through the list. Other passengers were staring now, some with curiosity, others with annoyance. Finally, Claudette looked up. "Fine," she said, stepping aside. Nadia walked past her, her hands shaking as she locked the bathroom door behind her. She stood in front of the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink, and took deep breaths. She wanted to cry, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. When Nadia returned to her seat, the situation escalated. Marlene had apparently decided that enough was enough. She stood up, her voice loud enough to carry through the entire cabin. "I paid $1,200 for this seat," she announced to no one in particular. "I did not pay to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Nadia froze, her heart pounding. Marlene turned to Claudette, who had appeared at the sound of raised voices. "She's making everyone uncomfortable." Marlene continued, gesturing at Nadia as if she were an object rather than a person. "Look at her. Does she look like she can afford first class?" A few passengers nodded in agreement. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Nadia opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. She felt small, powerless, and utterly alone. Then a voice cut through the tension. "She has every right to be here. Leave her alone." Nadia looked up to see a black man in his 50s seated 2 rows behind her, standing up. His name, she would later learn, was Randall, a successful business owner who had flown first class hundreds of times. Marlene turned on him. "Oh, please," she said with a sneer. "Don't defend her just because you know." The implication hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Claudette, rather than de-escalating the situation, made it worse. She called for the pilot. Within moments, Captain Harrison emerged from the cockpit, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and an air of authority. He looked at Nadia with the same suspicion that had followed her since she boarded. "Young lady," he said, his voice stern. "Is this your seat?" Nadia felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. "Yes, sir," she said, holding out her boarding pass. "Here." Harrison took the pass, examined it, then looked at Nadia again. "How did you get a first-class ticket?" he asked. The question felt like an accusation. "My mom bought it for me," Nadia said quietly. "What does your mom do?" Harrison asked, his tone suggesting he already doubted her answer. "She's an attorney," Nadia said, carefully avoiding the full truth. She didn't want to use her mother's position as a shield, didn't want to be the kind of person who name-dropped to get respect. She wanted to be treated like a human being because she deserved it, not because of who her mother was. Harrison didn't look convinced. "Uh-huh," he said slowly. "And where is she?" "She's meeting me in New York," Nadia said. Harrison exchanged a glance with Claudette, and in that glance, Nadia saw everything she needed to know. They had already made up their minds. "We've had issues before," Harrison said, his voice low but audible to the surrounding passengers, with people using stolen credit cards to buy tickets. Nadia's breath caught. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm going to need to call the airline to verify this ticket," Harrison said, pulling out his phone. Randall stepped forward. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice ringing with anger. "You're accusing a child of theft with zero evidence." Harrison turned to him. "Sir, I need you to sit down, or you'll be removed as well." Randall hesitated, then slowly sat, but his eyes never left Harrison. Nadia felt the world closing in around her. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. "Mom," she texted. "They think I stole the ticket. They're landing the plane. I'm so scared." She hit send just as Harrison returned to the cockpit. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making an unscheduled landing in Chicago due to a security concern. We apologize for the inconvenience. A collective groan rose from the passengers, and Nadia felt every pair of eyes in the cabin turn toward her. Marlene's voice rang out one more time. "Great. Now we're all delayed because of her." Nadia buried her face in her hands, and finally, let the tears fall. The descent into Chicago O'Hare was the longest 20 minutes of Nadia's life. The plane banked to the left, the city sprawling below them in grids of light and shadow, and she sat rigid in her seat, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Around her, passengers muttered complaints, checked their watches, tapped angrily at their phones to notify colleagues and family members of the delay. Marlene had turned fully away from Nadia, her body language radiating contempt, while others shot glares in her direction as if she had personally inconvenienced them. Nadia stared out the window, watching the ground rise to meet them, and wondered how her life had spiraled so completely out of control in the span of a single flight. When the wheels touched down with a jolt, Nadia's stomach lurched. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, and the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will be met by security personnel. This will only take a few moments." Nadia's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. The plane came to a full stop, and within seconds the forward door opened. 2 airport security officers, a stocky man named Boyd, and a sharp-eyed woman named Shelby, stepped aboard. Their eyes scanned the cabin, and Claudette pointed directly at Nadia. Boyd's gaze locked onto her, and he strode down the aisle with the kind of purposeful intensity usually reserved for actual criminals. "Nadia," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Nadia nodded, unable to speak. "You need to come with us," Boyd said. "It wasn't a request." "What did I do?" Nadia managed to whisper. Shelby stepped forward, her expression hard. "There's been a report of fraudulent ticket purchase. Stand up. Bring your belongings." Nadia stood on shaking legs, pulling her backpack from under the seat in front of her. As she stepped into the aisle, she had to walk past 20 rows of first-class passengers, every single one of them watching her. Marlene's lips curled into a satisfied smile. A man in a business suit shook his head in disapproval. Randall caught her eye and mouthed, "Stay strong." It was the only kindness she received. The walk down the jetway felt endless. Boyd walked ahead of her, Shelby behind, as if she might bolt at any moment. They led her through the terminal past gates, where travelers stopped to stare past coffee shops and newsstands, where employees paused mid-transaction to watch the teenager being escorted by security. Nadia kept her eyes on the ground, willing herself not to cry again, not in front of all these strangers. They arrived at a small windowless room with a metal table and 3 chairs. Boyd gestured for Nadia to sit. She did, clutching her backpack in her lap like a lifeline. Shelby closed the door, and the sound of it clicking shut felt like a prison cell locking. Boyd sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "Let's start with the basics," he said. "Whose credit card did you use to buy that ticket?" Nadia took a shaky breath. "My mom's. She bought it for me online." Shelby leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "What's your mom's name?" Nadia said. "Loretta what?" Boyd prompted. "Loretta Hayes." Boyd wrote the name down on a notepad. "And what does Loretta Hayes do that she can afford $1,200 tickets for her kid?" Nadia hesitated. She didn't want to say. It didn't want to use her mother's title as a shield, but she was running out of options. "She's the Attorney General of California," she said quietly. There was a beat of silence, and then Boyd laughed. Shelby joined in a sharp, mocking sound. "Sure she is," Boyd said, grinning at Shelby. "And I'm the president." Shelby pushed off the wall and walked closer to Nadia. "Honey, lying makes this worse." "Just tell us the truth." Nadia's frustration boiled over. "I am telling the truth," she said, her voice breaking. "Call her. Here's her number." She fumbled with her phone, pulling up her mother's contact information, but Boyd waved her off. "We're not calling some random number," he said. "We need to verify this with the airline and the credit card company. That takes time." While Boyd made phone calls and Shelby stood guard by the door, Nadia sat in silence, her mind racing. She thought about her mother, who was probably in a meeting right now, unaware that her daughter was being treated like a criminal. She thought about the other passengers on the plane, most of whom had probably already forgotten about her, relieved that the inconvenience was over. She thought about Claudette and Harrison, who had decided based on nothing but her appearance that she didn't belong. After what felt like an eternity, Shelby approached the table. "We're going to need to search your bag," she said. Nadia nodded numbly and handed over her backpack. Shelby dumped the contents onto the table. Out spilled Nadia's laptop, her iPad textbooks, her science notebook pens, headphones, a hoodie, and the certificate from Stanford. Shelby picked up the laptop, turning it over in her hands. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "It's mine," Nadia said. "For school." Boyd leaned forward. "Expensive stuff for a kid." Nadia wanted to scream. Instead, she said, "My mom bought them for me. For school. I'm a good student." Shelby picked up the certificate, unfolding it and reading aloud. "Stanford Science Summit for High Achievers." She looked at Nadia, her skepticism barely masked. "How did you get into this?" The way she emphasized "you" made Nadia's blood boil. "I was invited," Nadia said, her voice tight with anger. "I won a national science competition. They invited me to present my research." Boyd and Shelby exchanged glances, and for the first time Nadia saw a flicker of doubt in their expressions. Before either of them could respond, there was a knock on the door. A man in an airline uniform, his name tag reading Curtis, entered the room. He was holding a tablet and looked nervous. "Officers," Curtis said, glancing at Nadia. "I've been reviewing the ticket purchase." Boyd stood, and Curtis tapped on his tablet, his face growing pale. The ticket was purchased with a corporate credit card, registered to. He trailed off, swallowing hard. "To who?" Shelby demanded. Curtis looked at Nadia, then back at the officers. "To the office of the Attorney General of California." The room went silent. Curtis cleared his throat. "I need to make a phone call. Right now." He left the room in a hurry, and Boyd and Shelby stood frozen, the reality of their mistake beginning to dawn on them. Nadia sat in her chair, exhausted and angry, and waited for what would come next. While Nadia sat alone in that cold interrogation room 3,000 miles away in Sacramento, Loretta Hayes was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with state legislators when her phone buzzed on the table. She normally kept it silenced during meetings, but something made her glance at the screen. The message from Nadia was short, but it hit her like a physical blow. "Mom, they think I stole the ticket. They're landing the plane. I'm so scared." Loretta stood so abruptly, her chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through the discussion like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned toward her. "I need to leave," she said, her voice tight and controlled in a way that made everyone in the room understand this was not up for debate. She was out the door before anyone could respond, her phone already pressed to her ear. Her assistant answered on the first ring. "Charter a plane to Chicago." Loretta set her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she strode down the corridor. "I don't care what it costs. I need to be in the air in 30 minutes. She hung up and immediately dialed another number. Her voice was ice. "This is Attorney General Hayes. I need you to contact Chicago O'Hare Security immediately. My daughter is being detained. I want someone there in 10 minutes, and I want a full report on who authorized this." The next call was to her contacts at the FBI. Loretta didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The fury in her calm, measured tone was more terrifying than any scream. Within 2 hours, Loretta's charter jet touched down at O'Hare. She stepped off the plane in a tailored black suit, her briefcase in one hand, flanked by 2 of her senior staff members. Airport Director Ramona had been alerted to the Attorney General's arrival and was waiting on the tarmac, wringing her hands nervously. Attorney General Hayes Ramona began, her voice shaking slightly. "We're so sorry about the misunderstanding." Loretta's gaze could have cut glass. "Where is my daughter?" she asked. Ramona gestured toward the terminal. "This way, ma'am. We've prepared a private area." "I didn't ask for a private area," Loretta interrupted. "I asked where my daughter is." Ramona swallowed hard and led the way. They walked through restricted corridors past employees, who stopped and stared past security checkpoints that parted like water at Loretta's approach. When they reached the interrogation room, Loretta didn't knock. She pushed the door open, and the first thing she saw was Nadia sitting at that metal table, her eyes red from crying, her shoulders hunched. Mom, Nadia gasped, leaping from her chair and rushing into her mother's arms. Loretta held her daughter tightly, feeling Nadia's body shake with sobs. Over Nadia's shoulder, Loretta's eyes locked onto Boyd and Shelby, who stood frozen like deer in headlights. After a long moment, Loretta gently guided Nadia to sit down, then turned her full attention to the two officers. "Who authorized the detention of my daughter?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. Boyd cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were following protocol. Protocol for what Loretta cut him off. My daughter had a valid ticket, valid identification, and a boarding pass." "What was the probable cause for detaining her?" Shelby stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "The flight crew reported suspicious behavior." Loretta's eyebrow arched. "Define suspicious." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Boyd finally spoke. They said she didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger." Loretta let those words hang in the air for a moment. "Didn't fit the profile," she repeated slowly. "I see. And what profile is that, Officer Boyd?" Boyd said nothing. Loretta continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "I want the flight crew brought here. Now. I want the pilot. I want the passenger who made the complaint. And I want every piece of documentation related to this incident on my desk within the hour." Ramona, who had been standing in the doorway, looked like she might faint. "Attorney General, perhaps we can resolve this quietly." Loretta turned to her. "Quietly," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "My 16-year-old daughter was accused of theft, removed from an aircraft, interrogated without a parent or legal counsel present, and you want to handle this quietly." Ramona had no response. Within 30 minutes, a conference room had been prepared. Loretta sat at the head of the table, Nadia beside her, still shaken, but drawing strength from her mother's presence. Across from them sat Claudette and Captain Harrison, both looking significantly less confident than they had on the plane. Loretta studied them in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of her gaze settle over them like a heavy blanket. "I'm Attorney General Loretta Hayes," she finally said. "This is my daughter Nadia." Harrison's face had gone pale. "Attorney General, we didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Loretta interrupted. "That black teenagers can afford first-class tickets, that they might have parents who are successful. What exactly didn't you know, Captain Harrison?" Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it wisely, choosing silence. Claudette tried to speak. There were concerns from other passengers." "Which passengers?" Loretta demanded. Claudette hesitated. "A woman in first class." She felt uncomfortable. "Bring her in," Loretta said to Ramona. "I want to hear what made her so uncomfortable." Minutes later, Marlene Henderson was escorted into the room, and the moment she saw Loretta in her official capacity, her demeanor changed. The entitled confidence she had displayed on the plane evaporated. "Miss Henderson," Loretta said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You stated that my daughter didn't belong in first class. On what basis did you make that determination?" Marlene shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I didn't realize she was your daughter." "That's not what I asked," Loretta said. "I asked on what basis you decided she didn't belong." Marlene fumbled for words. "She was so young, and the way she was dressed." "The way she was dressed," Loretta repeated. "She was wearing a hoodie and jeans. Casual clothing for a cross-country flight. Is there a dress code for first class?" "I'm not aware of." Marlene's face flushed. "I just meant she looked like a regular teenager." As opposed to what exactly Loretta pressed, Marlene couldn't answer. The silence in the room was deafening. Loretta turned to Ramona. "I want copies of all communications between the flight crew and security. I want the passenger manifest. I want surveillance footage from the gate and the aircraft. And I want the airline CEO on the phone in 5 minutes." Ramona nodded frantically and rushed from the room. Loretta leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the faces of those who had humiliated her daughter. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot. Now let me ask you something. If you think Loretta is absolutely right to demand accountability, comment number 1 below. If you believe the airline staff were just following procedure, let me know your thoughts. And please hit that like button and subscribe, because you need to see what Loretta does next. Do you think the airline will face real consequences? Or will this get swept under the rug like so many incidents before it? Keep watching to find out. The airline CEO, a man named Garrett, who had built his career on carefully managed public relations and profit margins, was not having a good day. His assistant had interrupted his lunch with a frantic message that the Attorney General of California was demanding to speak with him immediately regarding an incident on one of his flights. Garrett had assumed it was some minor complaint that could be smoothed over with an apology and a voucher. He was wrong. When his phone rang and he answered, Loretta didn't waste time with small talk. Mr. Garrett, this is Attorney General Loretta Hayes. I'm calling regarding the treatment my daughter received on your flight this afternoon. Garrett's public relations instincts kicked in immediately. Attorney General Hayes, I am deeply, deeply sorry for any inconvenience. Sorry isn't enough. Loretta cut him off. This is systemic discrimination, and I have reason to believe it's not an isolated incident. How many other passengers has your crew racially profiled? Garrett stammered. We have very strict anti-discrimination policies in place. Then why? Loretta said, her voice like steel. Was my daughter's ticket verified multiple times when white passengers were waved through? Why was she denied the same service as other first-class passengers? Why was she accused of theft? With zero evidence, Garrett had no good answers. I assure you, I will conduct a full investigation. No, Loretta said. I will conduct the investigation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and I suggest you cooperate fully. By the time the sun set over Chicago, Loretta's team had assembled a mountain of evidence. Security footage from the gate showed Gilbert checking Nadia's boarding pass 3 times, while white passengers behind her walked through with barely a glance. The timestamps didn't lie. On the aircraft, cameras captured Claudette serving champagne to every passenger in first class except Nadia. The footage showed Claudette's facial expressions when she looked at Nadia, subtle but unmistakable looks of disgust and suspicion that she never directed at white passengers. There was video of Marlene pulling her Hermes bag closer when Nadia sat down, of passengers staring as Nadia was escorted off the plane of the pilot Harrison, speaking to her with barely concealed contempt. The evidence was damning, but Loretta wanted more. She wanted to know if this was a pattern. Her team pulled personnel records for Claudette and discovered something that made Loretta's jaw clench. 3 previous complaints of discriminatory behavior, all filed by black passengers. One complaint from a businessman who said Claudette had asked if he was a professional athlete, assuming that was the only way a black man could afford first class. Another from a woman who said Claudette had accused her of being in the wrong cabin. A third from a college student who said Claudette had called security because she thought his laptop was stolen. In every case, the airline had conducted an internal investigation and found the complaints to be unsubstantiated. The investigations had been performed by Claudette's direct supervisor, who was also white and who had apparently seen no problem with her behavior. Captain Harrison's record was even worse. In the past 2 years, he had made 5 emergency landings for what he classified as security concerns. Loretta's team pulled the reports for each incident. 4 of the 5 involved passengers of color. In one case, Harrison had landed the plane because he suspected a South Asian man of being a terrorist, based on nothing but the man's appearance and the fact that he was praying quietly in his seat. In another, he had removed a black woman because she had questioned a flight attendant's rude behavior and Harrison had deemed her aggressive. In a third, he had detained a Latino teenager who Harrison claimed was acting suspicious by wearing headphones and keeping to himself. Not a single one of these incidents had resulted in any actual security threat being discovered. Yet Harrison had faced no disciplinary action. The airline had simply paid out settlements to avoid lawsuits and moved on. Loretta was building a case not just against individuals, but against a system that protected them. She turned to Ramona, who had been sitting quietly in the corner looking more and more like she wanted to be anywhere else. I want Marlene Henderson's background, Loretta said. Ramona nodded and made a call. Within an hour, they had a profile. Marlene was a wealthy socialite, a board member of several exclusive country clubs that had histories of discrimination and an active opponent of affordable housing developments in her neighborhood. She had filed numerous complaints against neighbors she deemed undesirable, a thinly veiled code for people of color. She had money connections and a sense of entitlement that made her believe the world should bend to her preferences. Armed with this evidence, Loretta called an emergency meeting with the airline's top executives and legal team. The meeting took place in a conference room at O'Hare, and when Loretta walked in with Nadia by her side, the executives stood nervously. Loretta didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table and laid out her findings, with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "This is not an isolated incident," she began. "This is a pattern of discrimination that your airline has not only allowed, but enabled. Claudette has multiple complaints against her, none of which were properly investigated. Captain Harrison has a documented history of racially profiling passengers, and yet he continues to fly. Your policies look good on paper, but in practice, they're worthless." The airline's general counsel, a man named Preston, who had clearly been brought in to minimize legal exposure, tried to interject. "Attorney General, we understand your concerns, and we're prepared to offer compensation." Loretta's eyes flashed. "I don't want compensation. I want systemic change. I want accountability." She placed a folder on the table. "Effective immediately, Claudette is suspended pending termination. Captain Harrison is grounded. And this airline will implement mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, not the kind where people watch a video and check a box, but real substantive training with oversight and accountability." Preston looked to Garrett, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. "We'll need board approval for some of these measures." Loretta leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Then, I suggest you call an emergency board meeting. Because if you don't fix this, I'm filing federal charges for civil rights violations. And I will make sure every passenger who has ever been discriminated against on your airline knows they can join a class action lawsuit." The room went silent. Garrett finally nodded. "We'll do it," he said quietly. The story broke within hours. By the next morning, every major news outlet in the country was covering it. Attorney General's daughter, racially profiled on flight, read the headline on the front page of major newspapers. Cable news ran segments with legal analysts and civil rights advocates weighing in. Social media exploded. The hashtag Justice for Nadia began trending, followed quickly by Flying While Black, a phrase that resonated with thousands of people who had experienced similar treatment. Within 24 hours, the video footage that Loretta had obtained was leaked to the press, and the images of Nadia being treated with suspicion and disdain went viral. Millions watched as Claudette served champagne to white passengers while ignoring a black teenager. They saw Marlene clutching her purse, saw Harrison questioning Nadia's right to be there, saw security officers treating a 16-year-old girl like a criminal. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary people flooded social media with their own stories. A famous actress tweeted, "I've been asked if I'm in the right cabin more times than I can count. This has to stop." A professional athlete shared a video detailing how he had been accused of stealing his own luggage from an overhead bin. A college student posted screenshots of an email exchange with an airline after she had been removed from a flight for suspicious behavior, which turned out to be nothing more than asking for a blanket. Thousands of people, most of them black or brown, came forward with stories that painted a damning picture of systemic racism in the airline industry. Civil rights organizations called for boycotts. Consumer advocacy groups demanded investigations. The airline stock price plummeted by 12% in a single day, as investors worried about the financial and reputational fallout. Claudette, perhaps believing she could salvage her reputation, made the catastrophic decision to give an interview to a local news station. Sitting in her living room, she tried to present herself as the victim. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice defensive. "People are too sensitive these days. You can't say or do anything without someone getting offended." The interviewer, a seasoned journalist, pressed her. "But the footage shows you treating Nadia differently than other passengers. How do you explain that?" Claudette shifted uncomfortably. "If someone looks out of place, we have a duty to investigate. It's about safety." "Out of place?" how the interviewer asked. Claudette hesitated, realizing too late that she had walked into a trap. Just, not what you'd expect in first class. The interview went viral for all the wrong reasons. The phrase, "not what you'd expect," became a rallying cry for activists, a perfect encapsulation of the implicit bias that people of color faced every day. Within hours of the interview airing, the airline issued a statement announcing that Claudette had been terminated immediately. But the damage was done, and the public's anger only intensified. Captain Harrison, meanwhile, tried a different approach. The pilots' union initially defended him, with the union president issuing a statement saying pilots have the discretion to make safety decisions based on their professional judgment. But when Loretta released the data showing Harrison's pattern of emergency landings, all of which involved passengers of color and none of which had uncovered any actual threats, the union quickly backtracked. They issued a revised statement saying they would review the matter thoroughly, but by then, Harrison had already quietly resigned. His resignation letter, leaked to the press, was full of self-pity and denial, but it didn't matter. He was done. Marlene Henderson faced her own reckoning. Once her identity was revealed, the internet did what it does best. Investigative journalists and amateur sleuths uncovered her history of discriminatory behavior. Her membership at 2 exclusive country clubs was revoked. Business partners who had once courted her favor now distanced themselves, issuing statements condemning racism and pledging to do better. Marlene eventually released a public apology, but it was so clearly written by lawyers and so devoid of genuine remorse that it only made things worse. "I regret any misunderstanding," she said in the statement. "I have the utmost respect for all people." The apology was torn apart online, with critics pointing out that she hadn't actually admitted wrongdoing or apologized to Nadia directly. While Claudette Harrison and Marlene became pariahs, Nadia became a symbol. Letters of support poured in from around the world. Students at universities organized rallies in her honor. Scholarship funds were established in her name. Invitations to speak at conferences and events flooded her mother's office. Young activists, inspired by her story, launched a campaign called Nadia's Law, pushing for federal legislation that would create stronger protections against discrimination in transportation. But the attention came with a cost. Nadia, who had always been a private person, suddenly found herself at the center of a national conversation she never asked to be part of. News trucks camped outside her home. Reporters called at all hours. Strangers on the internet debated every aspect of her life, from her appearance to her academic achievements to whether she deserved sympathy. Some trolls claimed she was overreacting, that she should be grateful for the attention that she was playing the victim. The cruelty of strangers who knew nothing about her but felt entitled to judge her was almost as painful as the original incident. Congressional leaders took notice. Within 2 weeks, a hearing was scheduled to examine systemic discrimination in air travel. Loretta was asked to testify along with representatives from multiple airlines, civil rights organizations, and if she was willing, Nadia herself. The days following the incident were some of the hardest of Nadia's life. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on that plane, feeling the weight of judgmental stares, hearing Marlene's voice, saying she didn't belong, watching security officers approach her like she was dangerous. She woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, replaying the humiliation over and over again. Loretta noticed immediately. She cleared her schedule and stayed home with Nadia, holding her daughter, when the nightmares came, sitting with her in silence when words felt too heavy. "I should have been there with you," Loretta said one night, her voice breaking. Nadia looked at her mother, this strong, accomplished woman who had fought battles in courtrooms and won, and saw the guilt etched on her face. "It's not your fault, Mom," Nadia said softly. Loretta shook her head. "I fight these battles every day in court. I've spent my entire career trying to make things more fair, more just. And I couldn't protect my own daughter from experiencing this." Nadia took her mother's hand. "You did protect me. You came for me. You believed me. That's more than a lot of people have." Loretta arranged for Nadia to see a therapist, a woman named Dr. Geneva, who specialized in trauma and discrimination. In their first session, Nadia sat on a comfortable couch in a warm, softly lit office and tried to put her feelings into words. "I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently," Nadia said. "Like maybe if I'd dressed nicer, or if I'd been more assertive, or if I'd just told them right away who my mom was." "Doctor." Geneva leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "Nadia, nothing you could have done would have changed how they treated you. Their behavior was about their biases, not about you. Nadia nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed it yet. It's just, I've worked so hard. I've won awards. I got into Stanford's program. I'm a good student, a good person. And none of that mattered. They looked at me and saw. I don't even know what they saw. But it wasn't me. Dr. Geneva's voice was gentle. They saw what they expected to see, not what was really there. That's the insidious thing about prejudice. It blinds people to reality. Over the following weeks, Nadia attended therapy twice a week, slowly processing the trauma and beginning to understand that what happened to her was not her fault. During this time, letters began arriving. At first, just a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Loretta's staff had to set up a separate system just to manage the volume of mail addressed to Nadia. She read every single one. Many were from other young people of color who had experienced similar discrimination. A 17-year-old girl named Jasmine wrote about being kicked off a flight because a flight attendant said her natural hair was disruptive. A 15-year-old boy named Deshaun described being accused of stealing his own noise-canceling headphones because the flight crew didn't believe a black teenager could afford them. A college student named Keisha shared how she had been randomly selected for additional screening on 8 consecutive flights. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also galvanizing. Nadia began to realize that, while her story had garnered attention because of who her mother was, there were countless others who suffered the same treatment without any recourse. They didn't have an attorney general to advocate for them. They didn't have the resources to fight back. They endured the humiliation in silence, internalized the pain, and moved on because they had no other choice. That realization changed something in Nadia. One evening, she sat with her mother in the living room, surrounded by stacks of letters. "Mom," she said quietly, "we have to do something. Not just for me, for everyone." Loretta looked at her daughter, seeing a determination in her eyes that reminded her of herself at that age. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This will be hard. People will scrutinize you. They'll criticize you. You'll have to relive this experience over and over again." Nadia nodded. "I'm sure. They tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. I'm going to make sure no one else feels that way." Loretta pulled her daughter into a hug. "Then we'll do it together." Over the next few days, Loretta's legal team helped Nadia prepare for the congressional hearing. They ran through practice questions, taught her how to handle hostile interrogation, gave her media training. But Nadia insisted on writing her own testimony. "I want to use my own words," she said firmly. "Not lawyer words. Not talking points. My words." Loretta agreed. She read Nadia's draft testimony and was moved to tears by her daughter's eloquence and courage. The night before the hearing, Nadia couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk rereading the letters from people who had reached out to her, drawing strength from their stories. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was from Randall, the businessman who had defended her on the plane. "You showed me courage even when you were afraid," he wrote. "Now it's your turn to show them. Don't hold back. Tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may." Nadia folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket. The next morning, she stood in front of her mirror, dressed in a navy blue suit that Loretta had helped her pick out. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized the girl staring back. She looked older, more serious, like someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. But there was also strength there, a resilience that hadn't existed before. "You belong everywhere you want to be," she whispered to herself. Loretta appeared in the doorway. "Ready?" she asked. Nadia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned to face her mother. "Ready." They walked out together side by side and headed to the hearing that would change everything. The hearing room was packed. Journalists lined the walls, cameras pointed at the witness table like cannons. Members of Congress sat in their elevated seats, some looking genuinely interested, others checking their phones or whispering to aides. In the gallery, civil rights leaders, airline executives, and ordinary citizens who had managed to secure seats waited in tense anticipation. Loretta and Nadia entered together, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Nadia had never seen so many people in one place, all there because of what had happened to her. It was overwhelming, but she kept her head high, remembering her mother's advice. "You have every right to be here." Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." They took their seats at the witness table. Loretta squeezed Nadia's hand under the table, a silent gesture of support, and then let go. This was Nadia's moment. Senator Wallace, the committee chair, called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice echoing through the chamber, "to examine allegations of systemic discriminatory practices in the commercial aviation industry." This hearing was prompted by an incident involving Miss Nadia Hayes, a 16-year-old honors student who was subjected to what many are calling a clear case of racial profiling. We will hear testimony from Miss Hayes, from her mother, Attorney General Loretta Hayes, from representatives of the airline industry, and from other affected passengers. Our goal is to understand the scope of this problem and to determine what legislative action, if any, is necessary. He looked directly at Nadia. "Miss Hayes, we'll begin with you." Nadia stood her legs, feeling unsteady beneath her, and approached the microphone. She had practiced this moment 100 times, but now that it was real, her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She unfolded her written statement, her hands shaking slightly, and began to read. Her voice was quiet at first, barely more than a whisper, but as she continued, it grew stronger. "My name is Nadia Hayes," she began. "I'm 16 years old. I'm a junior in high school. I love science and mathematics. I've won awards for my research on renewable energy. I volunteer at a community center teaching younger kids how to code. I'm just a regular teenager, but on a flight from San Francisco to New York, I was treated like a criminal for one reason and one reason only: the color of my skin." She paused, gathering her courage, and then continued. "From the moment I arrived at the gate, I was singled out. My ticket was checked multiple times. I was asked if I was sure it was mine, as if I had somehow stumbled into first class by accident. When I boarded the plane, the flight attendant looked at me with suspicion not welcome. I was ignored during meal service. I was questioned when I tried to use the restroom. And when another passenger complained that I made her uncomfortable simply by sitting next to her, the crew didn't defend me. They sided with her." Nadia's voice wavered, but she pushed through. "The worst part wasn't the emergency landing or being interrogated by security. The worst part was how it made me feel. For a moment, just a moment, I started to doubt myself. I started to wonder if maybe I didn't belong there. And that's what racism does. It makes you question your own worth. It makes you feel small when you should feel proud." The room was silent. Every eye was on Nadia. Some members of Congress leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Nadia took a breath and looked up from her prepared statement. What she said next came straight from her heart. "I'm lucky," she continued. "I'm lucky because my mother is the Attorney General. I'm lucky because I have resources and a platform. But what about all the other kids who go through this and don't have anyone to fight for them? What about the people who get profiled and harassed and just have to take it because they can't afford to fight back? What about them?" She pulled out the letters she had received and held them up. "I've gotten hundreds of letters from people who have experienced the same thing. Black passengers accused of theft. Brown passengers pulled aside for extra screening. People of color told they don't belong in certain seats on a plane. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked." Nadia set the letters down and looked directly at the senators. "I'm here today to ask you to do something about it. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong." When Nadia finished, the room erupted in applause from the gallery. Senator Wallace had to use his gavel to restore order. "Thank you, Miss Hayes," he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "We will now proceed to questions." Senator Beaumont, a sympathetic-looking woman in her 50s, was the first to speak. "Nadia, thank you for your bravery in coming here today. In your view, what specific changes would you like to see in the airline industry?" Nadia had prepared for this question. She pulled out a handwritten list. 3 things, she said. First, mandatory anti-bias training for all airline staff, but not the kind where you just watch a video and check a box. Real training with testing and accountability. Second, an independent review board to investigate discrimination complaints, not internal investigations that protect the company. And third, federal tracking of discrimination incidents across all airlines made public so passengers can make informed choices about who they fly with. Senator Beaumont nodded approvingly. Those are excellent recommendations. But not everyone was supportive. Senator Finch, a man known for his skepticism of civil rights complaints, leaned into his microphone. Miss Hayes, with all due respect, isn't this just political correctness gone too far? Air travel has never been safer. Flight crews have to make split-second decisions about security. Shouldn't we give them the benefit of the doubt? Nadia didn't flinch. She looked Senator Finch directly in the eye. With respect, Senator, there's nothing politically correct about being treated as less than human. And this wasn't a split-second decision. This was a pattern of behavior over the course of an entire flight. They didn't see a security threat. They saw a black teenager and assumed I didn't belong. The gallery erupted in applause again, and this time Senator Wallace didn't bother to quiet them. Next, the airline CEO Garrett was called to testify. He looked far less confident than he had in his corporate headshot. Under questioning from Loretta, who had been given special permission to cross-examine, he was forced to admit a series of uncomfortable truths. Mr. Garrett, Loretta began your airline claims to have strict anti-discrimination policies. Can you tell us when these policies were implemented? Garrett shuffled his papers. We've had policies in place for years. I'm not asking about general policies, Loretta interrupted. I'm asking about the specific new measures you announced last week. When were those implemented? Garrett swallowed. Last week. So after this incident became public, Loretta pressed. Yes. And what about the 3 previous complaints filed against flight attendant Claudette? Were those investigated? They were, Garrett said. And what were the findings? They were determined to be unsubstantiated. Loretta raised an eyebrow. Unsubstantiated. By whom? By her supervisor. And is that supervisor also white? Garrett hesitated. Yes. So a white supervisor investigated complaints of racial bias made against a white flight attendant and found no wrongdoing. Do you see the problem with that? Garrett had no answer. Claudette herself was called to testify, though she had initially tried to refuse, citing emotional distress. She was subpoenaed and had no choice. She sat at the witness table looking defensive and angry, a far cry from the confident flight attendant who had wielded power over passengers. When asked about her treatment of Nadia, she doubled down on her position. I treat all passengers the same, she insisted. Loretta played the surveillance footage on screens throughout the chamber. Is that so? Loretta asked. Then why does this video show you serving champagne to every passenger in first class? Except my daughter. Claudette watched the footage, her face reddening. I must have overlooked her. You overlooked her 6 separate times during the flight. Loretta's voice was incredulous. You overlooked her when you served drinks. You overlooked her when you served meals. You overlooked her when you asked if anyone needed anything. 6 separate instances of overlooking the only black teenager on that flight. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? The footage played on showing Claudette's facial expressions, the subtle sneer when she looked at Nadia, the warmth she showed white passengers, and the coldness she directed at a 16-year-old girl. The visual evidence was undeniable. Claudette broke down. I didn't think. That's exactly the problem, Loretta said. You didn't think. You made assumptions based on race, and those assumptions caused real harm to a child. Then came a surprise. Randall, the businessman who had defended Nadia on the plane, appeared as a witness, bringing with him 3 other passengers who had experienced similar treatment. One by one, they told their stories. Keisha, a young professional, described being asked if she was a celebrity or athlete when she boarded first class. Like those are the only ways a black person can afford a premium ticket, she said bitterly. Maurice, a college professor, recounted being asked if he was lost when he sat in business class, despite having a valid boarding pass. Tanya, a nurse, revealed that she had been randomly selected for additional screening on 8 out of 10 flights she had taken in the past year, a statistical impossibility if the selection was truly random. The pattern was undeniable, painted in stark relief by story after story of discrimination. Senator Wallace had heard enough. He conferred briefly with other committee members, then addressed the chamber. Based on the testimony we've heard today, this committee recommends immediate action by the Department of Transportation. We are drafting legislation which we will call the Equal Skies Act that will include federal penalties for airlines with documented patterns of discrimination, a passenger bill of rights, mandatory public reporting of discrimination, complaints, and independent oversight. The room erupted in applause. Nadia felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief, of validation, of hope. 6 months later, Nadia stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by dignitaries, members of Congress, civil rights leaders, and the very people whose letters had inspired her to keep fighting. President Sullivan stood at a desk with the Equal Skies Act laid out before him, a series of pens arranged neatly beside the document. He looked at Nadia and smiled. "Miss Hayes, would you like to stand with me while I sign this?" Nadia glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. She stepped forward, her legs no longer shaking, her head held high. The cameras flashed as President Sullivan signed his name with deliberate strokes, using multiple pens so they could be distributed as keepsakes. When he finished, he turned and handed the first pen to Nadia. "This belongs to you," he said. "You started this." Nadia took the pen, holding it like the precious artifact it was, and then turned to distribute the other pens to Jasmine, Deshawn, Keisha, Maurice, and Tanya, the other passengers whose stories had helped make this moment possible. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. They had been heard, they had been believed, and now things were going to change. The changes came swiftly. All major airlines facing the threat of federal penalties and public boycotts implemented comprehensive anti-bias training programs. Unlike the perfunctory online modules of the past, these programs were in-depth, facilitated by civil rights experts, and required passing scores on assessments to ensure comprehension. Airlines hired independent civil rights compliance officers, individuals whose sole job was to investigate discrimination complaints without the conflict of interest that came from internal reviews. A public database was launched allowing anyone to see how many discrimination complaints had been filed against each airline, how those complaints had been resolved, and what disciplinary actions, if any, had been taken. The transparency was revolutionary. Within the first year, reported incidents of discrimination dropped by 73%, not because people stopped complaining, but because airlines, suddenly accountable, started taking the issue seriously. Several executives resigned or were forced out when their records of ignoring complaints came to light. The industry, for so long insulated from consequences, was finally being held to account. Claudette's life had changed dramatically, though not in the ways she might have hoped. Blacklisted from the airline industry, she now worked retail, a far cry from the authority she had once wielded at 30,000 feet. As part of a settlement to avoid further legal action, she was required to complete an extensive anti-racism program. Months into the process, she agreed to be interviewed by a documentary filmmaker exploring the aftermath of the case. Sitting in a small apartment that was a stark contrast to the comfortable suburban home she had lost in her divorce, Claudette looked worn and tired. "I didn't see her as a person," she admitted, her voice hollow. "I saw her as a threat to my comfort, to what I thought first class should look like. I was wrong. I was so wrong." The filmmaker asked if she had reached out to Nadia to apologize. "I wrote her a letter," Claudette said. "I don't know if she read it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted her to know that I understand now what I couldn't see then." Nadia had, in fact, received the letter. She hadn't responded, wasn't sure she ever would, but she hadn't thrown it away either. Forgiveness was complicated, and she was still figuring out what it meant to her. Captain Harrison had his own reckoning. His pilot's license was suspended for 2 years, and he was required to undergo anti-bias training before he could even apply for reinstatement. He issued a public statement admitting his actions had been driven by unconscious bias, a statement that was met with skepticism by many who felt his contrition came only after facing consequences. But Harrison did something that surprised people. He began volunteering with a youth aviation program in a predominantly black neighborhood, teaching kids how to fly small planes, sharing his love of aviation while also confronting his own prejudices. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Marlene Henderson, meanwhile, had lost almost everything. Her husband had divorced her, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew it was to distance himself from the scandal. Her social standing evaporated. The exclusive circles she had once dominated wanted nothing to do with her. In a desperate attempt to salvage something, she began working with a civil rights organization, doing community service and attending workshops. When she finally reached out to Nadia, it was in person, not through a lawyer's letter. They met at a coffee shop, a neutral space with Loretta present. Marlene's apology was halting and awkward, but it was real. "I spent my whole life building walls," she said, tears in her eyes. "I was taught that people like me were supposed to be separate from people like you, and I never questioned it until it was too late. I'm trying to tear those walls down now." Nadia listened, then said simply, "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. For Nadia, the transformation was internal as much as external. She became a youth advocate, speaking at schools and conferences about discrimination, resilience, and the power of speaking up. She started a nonprofit called First Class Citizens, dedicated to helping young people fight discrimination in all its forms, not just in aviation, but in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. The organization provided legal resources, connected victims with advocates, and amplified their stories. Nadia was accepted to MIT with early admission, planning to study both law and engineering. "I want to build things that make the world better," she explained in an interview, "and I want to make sure everyone has access to those things, not just people who look a certain way or come from certain backgrounds." When asked what she had learned from her experience, she thought carefully before answering. "They tried to make me smaller," she said. "They tried to convince me I didn't belong. Instead, I grew. I found my voice, my purpose. That's what I want other kids to know. When people try to diminish you, you get to choose how you respond. You can shrink or you can rise." 1 year after the incident, Nadia and Loretta found themselves on another flight, this time with a different airline that had earned high marks on the new discrimination tracking database. They sat side by side in first class, and when the flight attendant approached, she greeted them with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard," she said, smiling. "Can I get you anything to start?" Nadia smiled back. "Orange juice, please. In a glass this time." The flight attendant looked momentarily confused, but Nadia just shook her head, inside joke. When the drinks arrived in proper glassware, Loretta raised her glass. "To you," she said. "I'm so proud of you." Nadia clinked her glass against her mother's. "I learned from the best." They flew in comfortable silence for a while, and Nadia found herself thinking about how far she had come. The nightmares had faded. The anxiety had lessened. She could board a plane now without her heart racing, could sit in first class without feeling like she had to prove she belonged. She simply existed as she always should have been allowed to. Flash forward 3 years. Nadia, now a college student at MIT, was flying home for winter break. As she settled into her first-class seat, she noticed a young black girl, maybe 12 years old, walking nervously down the aisle, checking her seat number repeatedly. The girl's father wasn't with her. She was traveling alone, and from the anxious way she gripped her boarding pass, Nadia could tell she was scared. A flight attendant approached the girl, and Nadia's radar went up. "Excuse me, honey," the flight attendant said, her tone slightly condescending. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" Nadia stood up immediately. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant turned to her. "Oh, I was just checking. She has a ticket," Nadia said. "That's all that matters." The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded and moved on. Nadia sat down next to the girl, who looked at her with wide, relieved eyes. "Thank you," the girl whispered. "I was scared." Nadia smiled. "Don't be scared. You belong here. You belong everywhere." The girl's eyes widened further. Are you Nadia Hayes?" Nadia nodded. "I am." "You're my hero," the girl said. "I want to be like you." Nadia felt tears prick her eyes. "You already are," she said. "You're here, aren't you?" The girl smiled, and for the rest of the flight, they talked about science, about school, about dreams and possibilities. When they landed, the girl hugged Nadia tightly. "Thank you for being brave," she said. Nadia hugged her back. Thank you for reminding me why it matters. The screen fades to black and text appears. The Equal Skies Act resulted in a 73% reduction in reported discrimination incidents in the first year. Nadia Hayes graduated from MIT and Harvard Law School. She now serves as Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights, following in her mother's footsteps while carving her own path. Loretta Hayes became the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court, confirmed by a bipartisan vote that reflected the nation's recognition of her decades of service. Their story changed an industry, but more importantly, it changed how millions of young people see themselves. First class isn't about where you sit. It's about knowing you have the right to be there. The fight for equality continues, but because of voices like Nadia's, it's a fight we're winning, one brave act at a time. So let me ask you this. What story from today resonated most with you? Was it Nadia's courage in the face of humiliation? Was it Loretta's fierce protection of her daughter? Was it the redemption arc of people like Claudette realizing their mistakes? Drop a comment below and let me know. If this story moved, you hit that like button. If you believe every young person deserves to be treated with dignity no matter their race, subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep sharing stories that matter, stories that inspire change. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been made to feel like they don't belong, someone who needs to be reminded that they do. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring. Remember, you belong everywhere you choose to be. Until next time, keep fighting for justice, keep standing up for what's right, and keep believing in a better world. We're building it together, one story at a time. This story teaches us that silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates harm. Nadia's experience reveals how systemic racism operates through assumptions, microaggressions, and unchecked bias that people of color face daily. The courage to speak up, even when afraid, can spark transformative change that protects countless others. We learn that privilege comes with responsibility. Loretta used her position not just to defend her daughter, but to expose patterns of discrimination that had been ignored for years. True advocacy means fighting for those who lack the platform to fight for themselves. The story also shows that accountability matters more than apologies. Claudette's termination, Harrison's suspension, and the industry-wide reforms demonstrate that real change requires consequences, not just words. We see the power of documentation and evidence. Surveillance footage, complaint records, and data patterns turned individual experiences into undeniable proof of systemic problems. Most importantly, this story reminds us that belonging is not something we earn through credentials or compliance. Nadia belonged in first class simply because she was human, because she had a valid ticket, because dignity is a birthright. When institutions fail to recognize that basic truth, we must demand better. Change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as normal. Nadia transformed her trauma into purpose, ensuring future generations wouldn't endure what she survived. Which moment in Nadia's journey impacted you most? Was it her courage during the hearing, Loretta's fierce defense, or the systematic changes that followed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters in these conversations. If you believe no child should ever be made to feel they don't belong, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that inspire real change and challenge injustice. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on powerful narratives that need to be heard. Share this video with your family, friends, coworkers, and anyone who needs a reminder that speaking up against discrimination makes a difference. Share it in your community groups, on your social media, everywhere. These stories change hearts and minds when they reach the right people. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching, for caring, and for being part of a community that refuses to stay silent. Your engagement helps these important stories reach millions who need to hear them. May you always stand firm in your worth, never doubt your right to take up space, and find the courage to speak truth to power when the moment calls for it. Until our next story, keep fighting for justice, keep lifting others up, and keep believing that a more equitable world is possible. Together, we're making it happen.